Welcome back to International Radio Tours. This is Lady Selah Sujuris hosting, and I am here with our special guest, Captain Wilbur H. Vantine, author of Some Nautical Tales, and he's been sharing with us some very interesting stories out of his book. But we're going to take a break from the voyages, and I want to hear about your hobby. Now, what do you mean when you say that you tried to observe every star in the nautical almanac?
Well, it's been a long time, but as I recall, there were 65 principal stars that were listed in the almanac that the U.S. government produced, and the stars. There's one more sidereal day in a year that days, and so it's about 4 minutes a day, 3 minutes and 56 seconds, I believe it is. The stars are every.
You were breaking up there just a moment, there, Captain Vantine. So there's 65 of them, and there was a star for every what?
No, there was. If I recall, there were 65 stars that were for normal observations. You do a calculation, you get about, you find the star, and you would observe it. It has to be at dusk or dawn when you could see both the star and the horizon. And as I recall, there were 65 of them that were listed as standard stars in the Nautical Almanac, but some of them were only visible in the southern hemisphere, and some only visible in the northern hemisphere. And of course, they varied during the season. Every day, the stars came up 4 minutes earlier than they had the day before. So it took time in both the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere to be able to take them all. But I was persistent and tried real hard, and eventually I was able to do that. And of course, the trips to the southern hemisphere were essential to be able to get that finally done. I'm amazed when I drive my car. I guess everyone has similar things now, but you can push buttons.
You're breaking up a little bit more, Captain Vantine. I do want to let our listeners know that due to the storms and rain that people experienced in the hurricane, that Hurricane Patricia that hit off of Mexico, there has been quite a bit of interference in radio communication and broadcasting, cell phones, and various different things like that. So just bear with us. Occasionally we do hit some of those spots, but usually they clear quite quickly. So please, stay tuned, because Captain Vantine always has very enjoyable and interesting stories throughout his entire book. So Captain Vantine, are you back with us now?
Can you hear me now okay?
Yes, very clear, very clear. So, yeah, I was just explaining to people sometimes we hit a spot and that happens, but thank you for sharing us, about that hobby. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing for you to do, especially with all the tasks that you had. We're running out of time here, so I want to make sure that we get to the some of the other interesting voyages that you had. And this one, the SS George Clement Perkins, it was your second tour of duty. And so share with us a little bit about that time period.
Well, I had spent a little over a year on the George Clement Perkins as a second mate, and I took a voyage off so I could raise my license, and which I did. and I came back with a chief mate's license, but still serving as second mate. I was considered to be far too young to be sailing as chief mate, where you direct the deck crew and all the ship's maintenance. But anyway, we loaded. Let me see. Let me look at the book here. Oh yes, I rejoined the ship in New Orleans, and we took a cargo for Kingston and San Juan, and then returned to New Orleans. The time in Jamaica was not pleasant. The people there are nearly all descendants, and there was a strike on against the buses, so we were told that we'd have to put up to town. And in those days, the men all wore hats, and I was walking along wearing my Stetson. Some young man ran up from behind, grabbed my hat, and ran off with it, and I couldn't catch him. So our time in Jamaica was not pleasant. Mm-hmm. And so then we had several more voyages. We ended up on the West Coast, and we went to Otaru, Japan, which was unusual. It was quite different from my previous times in Japan. Had been to Hokkaido Island and Kyushu Island to the south, but Hokkaido Island in the north is more sparsely populated, and it was really old-fashioned. Not only did the women wear the kimonos and so forth, but the men on Hokkaido Island also wore the traditional Japanese garb, and you would see a family, a Japanese, walking along the walk. The man would be walking in front, and his wife would be walking behind him with her hands in the opposite sleeves, looking down at the ground in front of her, taking and never looking up or to side. It was really a glimpse in the past, I guess, for the Japanese, but the men really ruled the roost in Japan.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because we've seen that in movies and various different things, but you actually saw this in person yourself.
We had an interesting event occur in Otaru. We had a Finnish able seaman on the ship that he'd been on my watch, 12 to 4 watch, and I got to know him pretty well. And he told me about his background. When World War II started, he was sailing in the Norwegian Merchant Marine, and the ship was in port when the Germans invaded Norway. And the first night, the captain and the crew on that ship decided to make a break for it, and they got out of the harbor in the midnight without any lights, of course, so forth, and made it over to England and spent the rest of the war hauling cargo for their lives. But anyway, his name was his surname was Pulley. I'm not sure how to spell it, but it was pronounced Pulley. But he shacked up in this little town of Otaru, and as in all Japanese establishments, he had to leave his shoes at the door. Well, during the night, somebody stole his shoes. So the next morning, it was an important. This was a rather dramatic problem because there was snow on the ground and it was cold. So he went out barefooted, and the first Japanese man he encountered, he forcibly removed his rubber boots he was wearing. They were a little bit tight for him, but he hobbled back to the ship in these Japanese rubber boots. That was a
wow. That is quite interesting story. So he literally just took his boots so he could get back to the ship. Wow.
I wonder what that Japanese fellow was thinking.
I know. Could you even imagine? Yes, that is very interesting. So One of the stories, and I believe kind of uh, when you were, it was probably near the voyage, and you had a big typhoon that you had to deal with. Most of us have never been on a ship in the waters and a typhoon. Could you share a little bit about what you experienced then?
I believe you're referring to the typhoon that occurred when my ship was in Kobe.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Well, I was second mate on the ship, and the ship was tied up to a big. We'd been there 2 or 3 days, and this typhoon was bearing down on the port, and they stopped the water taxi service when the captain and the chief mate and about half the crew were ashore, which left me in charge of the ship. The Japanese people, the Japanese shore authorities came out and gave us assistance. We put out every line we could to the mooring buoy, and the bosun was aboard, so I had him get what crew members were available and batten down the hatches. And the typhoon started blowing hard late afternoon, and I had the engineers ready to run the engine on slow ahead or whatever we needed. And as it got dark, I crouched down on the behind the bulwarks on the bow so I could see the lines leading to the buoy. And as the wind blew hard, I had telephone conversation with the bridge in the engine room. Most of the time, I slowed the engine. A couple of times, I increased a half. And also, I had a phone in the wheelhouse to put the rudder there, and passed over us. And suddenly, the wind stopped blowing, and the stars came out. It was clear, for about 15, 20 minutes, and then it started blowing hard from the opposite direction. So that was my first experience with a typhoon or a hurricane. And we didn't have any damage. Stuff that we weren't able to secure, like dunnage on deck, blew away, but there was no damage to the ship, and we were able to stay attached to the buoy. So it went. We survived that storm okay.
Mm-hmm. You had been throughout your career. I mean, actually, the storms were not. You were running into those. That was more common for you in the career that you had, being on the water in the ships.
Yes,
I noticed there's
several hurricanes and typhoons, and of course, I was described in my book. I was in a superstorm that was worse than any of the tropical storms I was in. It was unbelievable. On this recent hurricane they had off Mexico, they said it was the strongest one they had in the Western Hemisphere. The barometer got down to 25 some inches. Well, I was in a storm where it also got down that low. That's described in my book. It was not a hurricane, it was or a typhoon, but it was a superstorm, and the barometer got that low, down 25 some inches.
Interesting.
Of barometric pressure.
Mhm. Mhm. And you actually, being that you're joining us from Texas now, for our listeners, the storm has already passed. However, the rains and the flooding have continued on, and you're in Texas, Captain